Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. Today, the eclipse of April 8th, 2024. I had the great good fortune to be with one of my favorite people, Dennis McKenna, in the heart of Chaco Canyon for the eclipse. It was not total there, but Chaco Canyon is one of the most extraordinary places that I have ever been. It's in extreme northwestern New Mexico. It's a sacred place. And it was designed more than a millennium ago to be a calendar, to be able to determine equinoxes, or observe them at least, and solstices, and to help the people, the Puebloan people, to know when to plant and when to harvest and when to migrate and when to do their festivals. So here's something before the Arabic alphabet, an entirely different system, surely lunar in some sense of the term, and solar, without instruments of the kind that we take for granted, telescopes and computers and so on. Observing the heavens over millennia, passing on this information from medicine man to astronomer to skywatcher, etc., preserving this oral knowledge of the world, and then applying it in stone at Chaco Canyon, which, even if it weren't a calendar, even if there hadn't been an eclipse, is one of the most extraordinary and beautiful and moving places that I have ever been. So I recorded while I was there in real time. I've also had a chance to talk to our Enlightenment correspondent, Mr. David Nicandri of the state of Washington. So you'll get a little sense here of what it is to see the eclipse in a sacred place, Chaco Canyon. And now I'm just looking out at this view shed, and it's just absolutely astonishing. And here's what surprised me. I've never been here before. I've been told for many, many years, oh, you need to go to Chaco Canyon. It's even better. Canyon de Chelly. But of course, just think of that. I mean, like, oh, I've been to a better Anasazi site than you have. I mean, there's a hierarchy of these things, and people create their own hierarchies, and then they are very righteous about it when they talk to others and say, oh, I mean, yeah, of course, Chaco's pretty good, but I mean, it's Mesa Verde, really, that kind of thing. And this, you think, wow, the human ego finds absolutely anything. The human ego can attach to any subject, to any sport, to any activity, to any craft, to any speech, to any relationship. John Adams was right that the rage for distinction is the fundamental human impulse. Everyone wants to be the strongest, the most beautiful, the most poetic, the sexiest, the richest, the best traveled, the most enlightened, the best ballerina, the finest musketeer or black powder expert, the finest archer or philatelist. This amazing, the human competitive urge, which I suppose is why we're still clawing around the earth after all these difficulties and more to come. At any rate, this is spectacular, and it wouldn't be as spectacular if it weren't cloudy. And it certainly wouldn't be this spectacular if there were hundreds and hundreds of people here. But there aren't many people here, and the people here mostly are being quiet. It just has a beautiful, beautiful look. Subtle. Lots of gray-green. Cliffs. The clouds are kind of long and wispy, but there's very few that could be called cumulus. The sun is now completely occluded, so behind a cloud, and it's as gray as it has been here all day. The eclipse of 2024. I'm Clay Jenkinson for Listening to America in the heart of the heart of the heart of this incredible country. Keep listening, everyone. So Dennis, here we are at Chaco. What have you experienced with the eclipse?
I just think it's an amazing place to be, just very mostly serene, and there's a young hawk, red-tailed hawk, learning to fly here in the cliffs, and he or she's been calling, and it's just carried through this canyon. It's just been amazing.
Can you see it?
Yeah.
The bird. And so the eclipse is at about 3/5, I would say, probably the most occlusion we're going to get. Is it what you expected?
I went through a similar eclipse not too long ago, and so yes, I think it is. It's what I expected.
What a place to have this moment.
It is an amazing place. I mean, these stones, these old dwellings. It's just
the graciousness of our hosts.
Oh, it's amazing.
To answer silly questions and to be patient with us. And
yeah.
But it's almost complete solitude, even though we're in a small group. It's what better place can you imagine to see the eclipse of 2024 in than Chaco Canyon?
I don't think there could be one.
I mean, obviously you can get 100% somewhere else.
But, just the history, the human history here, and its connection with the land, the moon, the sun. It's amazing.
A cosmological people in a way that we no longer are.
Exactly.
So here were a people that for whom the sort of religious or sacramentalizing of the cosmos was essential to their way of life. Beginning in our 17th century, we de-essentialized it in our way of life. We no longer, now we kind of laugh at astrology, which we should, and we laugh at a number of these old views, the Ptolemaic view of the world. But back then, at least, people felt that they lived in a sort of God-active universe, and that when they looked at the stars, they weren't just looking at light years. I had the great good fortune to be able to observe the eclipse at Chaco Canyon. I'd never been there before. It's in northwestern New Mexico. I'd been to other canyons, of course, including the Snake and Grand Canyon, and I've been to Canyon de Chelly, but for years, even decades, people have told me that Chaco Canyon is the place one must see, and now I see why. Because it's not just an extraordinary ruin, if we're allowed to call it that, but it was a calendar. It was an edifice, a campus that was designed to verify and illuminate solstices, equinoxes, and eclipses, among other celestial phenomena. Think of it, this was worked out 1,000 years ago, before European science really even took off. How? How did they do it? The oral tradition must have been extremely tenacious. We have the advantage of permanent written records, of data, of sophisticated clocks, written history of eclipses and equinoxes and so on. So here was a people entirely oral, although they had pictographs, and here was a people entirely oral, although they had pictographs and petroglyphs, who were able to accumulate this knowledge over time, and I'm talking deep time, decades, even centuries, perhaps longer, and to maintain that knowledge somehow, and to be able to bring it up at appropriate times, and to plan an edifice like Chaco Canyon so far in advance that they knew that it would accurately depict these important markers in celestial activity. Stunning, astonishing, flabbergasting, really. And I always say, if you gave me $1 million and I couldn't consult any books or the internet or history, and said, buy any telescope you want and start observing the heavens and tell us some of the patterns you see for planets and comets and transit of this and that, I'd just throw up my hands. It was an amazing experience. Now, you may remember from the Thomas Jefferson Hour that I was able to be in Wyoming for the total solar eclipse of 2017. There was totality there, not in Chaco. In Chaco, we had about 4/5 totality, and there's a world of difference between the two. I remember being in Wyoming and experiencing the totality and seeing the world go silent and dark, and thinking of what it must mean for a people that doesn't yet understand these phenomena to see the sun blink out briefly. It's shocking enough for us who think we know the apparatus, the celestial mechanics behind all of this. And so this was a very different sort of experience. The last one was on a ranch road out in the middle of nowhere, probably 30 or 40 miles from Casper. I wasn't entirely alone. There were 6 or 7 other cars parked down that gravel path, but I was essentially alone. And I recorded my impressions. Then you can go back and look in the archives of the Thomas Jefferson Hour and find that program. It would be from 2017 with David Swenson, who also observed it independently of me, also in Wyoming that day. At this time, we were in a sacred place chosen by our scout, Frank Lister, who is scouting for my big Travel to Charlie tour that begins, by the way, in 2 weeks. Begins on the 27th of April. Oh my, I'm ready. I've been making lists, I've been packing, I've been working the itineraries, I've been making appointments with scholars and with historic sites all the way out and all the way back, trying to determine how many miles I can honestly make per day and still listen to America. It's all extremely interesting. I can't tell you how thrilled I am, not nervous. I'm sure I will feel some nerves with having all that important and expensive rolling stock behind me. But mostly I'm just feeling deep, deep delight. So that's all coming up, but this was a Listening to America trip to Chaco Canyon, which I had never seen before. And I will be back, and I will be back with knowledge. We had a wonderful Navajo and Zia guide by the name of Kailo Winters and his wife, Terry. They spread out a beautiful tablecloth on a picnic table, and the temperature was perfect, in the 50s somewhere, late 50s. There were only a dozen people in the entire park property. So we essentially had one of the world's most sacred places to ourselves with a Navajo and Zia guide. You couldn't ask for better. If we'd been at Niagara Falls, there would have been 100,000 other people, which would have been interesting too. But this was almost the perfect alternative. We need to take another short break. When we come back, I will bring in our favorite Enlightenment correspondent, Mr. David Nicandri. We'll see how he observed the eclipse, if he did. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome to the special edition of Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. I'm talking with our Enlightenment correspondent, David Nicandri of the state of Washington, formerly the executive director of the Washington State Historical Society, now the author of several books, most recently a volume in the press about Captain James Cook, which is an appropriate way to start, Dave. Why are events like this, eclipses, transit of Venus, transit of Mercury, why are events like this of such importance to the Enlightenment?
Yeah, that's a great question, Clay. I think it has to do with there's 2 levels of appreciation, I think. There's the natural wonder, the stupendous aesthetic effect, truly almost the very definition of awesomeness. And then there's the kind of the technical, deeply mathematical aspect of this, which is actually a human construct. So the thing that I'm particularly amazed about, both in regard to the recent eclipse, transits of various sorts, and of course, the eclipse, the solar eclipse, is a transit. It's the transit of the moon across the face of the sun. It's the magnitude of the covering up of the sun that is the defining feature. But the deeply mathematical and intricate understanding that humans have developed about the working of the cosmos, I think those are the 2 driving forces: aesthetic appreciation of nature's power, and an understanding and appreciation of humanity's ability to understand the cosmos at work.
Cosmos is a Greek word meaning order, and the Greeks found order in the skies. If you can predict an eclipse, you know how the solar system works.
Yes, in great detail. And this has actually been a facet of Western civilization now for hundreds of years. I mean, it's one thing for modern astronomers to kind of calculate exactly when an eclipse is going to start, where it's going to end, what part of the earth it's going to cover in the shadow. But to imagine scientists, natural philosophers, hundreds of years ago in Newton's period, and actually going all the way back to perhaps the ancient Greeks and the Egyptians, and maybe other cultures and civilizations as well, that people could kind of figure this out just by observing the pattern of occurrences, doing all of that on kind of pencil and paper, figuring out, it's just stupendous, I think. And it speaks well of our species that we're able to figure this out.
Dave, you mentioned that ancient observers all the way back to Babylonia and maybe farther were able to understand these things without telescopes, without our numerical system, without the precision of our modern calendars. It's essentially impossible to imagine how they could have done it because, of course, if you have an eclipse today, the next one will be 18 years from now. But what I read the other day is that in any given zip code, if I can use an anachronistic term, it's only once in 375 years that you have a total eclipse. So you only get a total eclipse if you're lucky. And of course, in the ancient world, people could not travel the way they did in the Enlightenment and today. Captain Cook could go to Tahiti to observe the transit of Venus. Today, you can fly anywhere. People fly around to stay with the eclipse as it appears to move around the circumference of the Earth. Back then, without any of the scientific instruments that we take for granted, without calculus, without ephemera, these are these sort of catalogs of where the stars are and the phases of the moon at any given time, and without the kind of calendars or mathematical systems that we now use and are almost universally used in our time, they could predict these things. I don't understand how they could do it.
Well, exactly, Clay. And in preparation of our conversation today, I was poking around on the internet. And I mean, I had a kind of an intuitive sense. I know I'm complimenting myself here. I had an intuitive sense of the deep background, trigonomic, if that's the right math, calculus, or whatever mathematical species we're talking about. I had a sense it was complicated, but I actually went in and looked at some of the formulas. It was simply it's like trying to get a sense of the size of the universe. I mean, it was literally mind-boggling to me. I just thought to myself, oh my, look at this.
Thales, the Greek mathematician and astronomer, predicts an eclipse in 580 BC, Dave.
It is mind-numbing. But I want to go back to one thing you said, Clay, because that was one of my several reflections that I had on this particular occasion. One is the fact that, Cook famously went halfway around the world from his homeland to observe the transit of Venus. But as you yourself noted, and we saw in television and newspaper reports online, people went from all over North America to find themselves in the path of totality. So in that sense, that's kind of an echo of the past. I mean, people probably didn't go looking for eclipses prior to Cook's era. They would wait for an eclipse to come to them, so to speak. But now with modern technology, you can fly around. In fact, Carly Simon famously wrote a lyric about this, I think of 1972, about some guy that got on a plane to watch the total eclipse of the sun. So, there is a long, deep cultural and mathematical history at play.
And yet, if I gave you $1 million and no access to computers and no access to history, and just said, okay, Dave, buy the best telescope you want and start charting the sky, would you? Why don't you discover the planets? Why don't you look at try to figure out their periodicity? Why don't you make sense of asteroids and comets and transit of this and that and partial eclipses and full eclipses? Even you, who are deeply committed to the work of the Enlightenment, would throw up your hands and say, I don't know where to begin.
Exactly right. I was just going to say that if I had to respond, my response would be, where do I start? I suppose keeping some kind of a mental log. But here's where our old concept of the Republic of Letters and its predecessor notions, Clay, comes into play, because any one figure, not even Newton or Galileo, was starting from scratch. Now, truly, someone was the first one. It might have been those Babylonian astronomers you alluded to. So there were there was a body of people, but it's the cumulative building of the knowledge base, and so it could be that even someone like Newton or Cook was there. Well, thank God for those people who several centuries ago, like Halley, laid the groundwork for us to work with. So it's a cumulative process, and it truly must be said, as much as we've come to learn about the cosmos, it's such a small part of what's out there to discover. That itself is a mind-numbing prospect.
Fair enough, but I look at it sort of through Jeffersonian Enlightenment eyes, that this is one of those moments when the curtain of the cosmos is opened and we get to see the clock inside. That's why they were so thrilled. And I don't think that a billionaire today, feeling the great awe of seeing an eclipse in its totality, or that, for that matter, a high school teacher from Houston, can have anything like the sense of sheer excitement and scientific triumph that was felt when people figured this out, and when Cook, with some help from the British government, could travel across the planet to be in a place to do something that was purely scientific. Now, of course, he was also the spearhead of empire and so on, but he was sent there as a scientist to get data. And when this happened, when he could actually look up and see the transit of Venus, this was not a lunar eclipse or a solar eclipse. When he could see the transit of Venus, this was not a lunar or solar eclipse, he must have felt some sort of ecstasy that we cannot any longer really get.
Yeah, I agree. And this was one of my reflections. I was actually watching the eclipse on CBC, the Canadian television network, hoping, well, in part because they hosted their coverage, Clay, from Niagara Falls. Now, you think of a juxtaposition of natural forces, Niagara Falls, Ontario, within the path of totality. That, I mean, I maybe Yellowstone, Devil's Tower, Grand Canyon. I can think of a few places that might be in the category of Niagara Falls, but I was instantly captivated by their production decision to host their coverage there. And so I was watching, and of course, they came on the air just when the eclipse began down in the Baja California, or Mexico, Mazatlan, and I began to think again the phenomenon of which Cook was a part. Cook wasn't the only one looking for the transit of Venus. There was this Jesuit abbey who was at Cabo San Lucas, got yellow fever, died 2 months later. Somebody who would sail with Cook on his second voyage, William Wales, an astronomer. He was up on the shores of Hudson Bay. Thomas Jefferson, King George III, people in India, South Africa, Siberia. So the notion of capturing this, going some exotic location, but the pièce de résistance, though, to bring it back to Cook, is perhaps inevitably I do with almost everything. It's become kind of a running joke between you and I. Cook, in some measure, Clay, got the assignment of taking some other astronomers, including his own portfolio as an astronomer from the Royal Society, because in his previous work doing the survey of Newfoundland, which that island off the east coast, the maritime Canadian province, which Great Britain had secured from France as a function of the 7 Years' War, Cook was doing the comprehensive mapping of its coastline and knew there was a solar eclipse coming. He anticipated it, and he first came to the attention of major figures at the Royal Society who had commissioned the voyage to Tahiti in 1769. In 1766, near the present town of Burgeo, Newfoundland, Cook observed a solar eclipse. It wasn't total there, but he named it Eclipse Island. It's still on the map. And by his dipping his toes in the water of Enlightenment science, I'm kind of mixing my metaphors here. I think the people at the Admiralty came to understand this is an exceptional guy. This is a guy who can map with the best of them, but is active enough, interested enough, intellectually capable enough that he can not only anticipate an eclipse, record it, and report on it to the Royal Society. I think it was literally at that point when that report was published that the folks in the Admiralty realized they had a rare talent on their hands.
No question whatsoever. And he left names in Tahiti too, didn't he?
Yeah, well, Point Venus is still a famous landmark among many. And on the same voyage, I mean, the transit of Venus, I think, was in late June of 1769, maybe early July. But in the following November, I think November 9th of 1769, he's in New Zealand now, and he observes the transit of Mercury. So it's remarkable.
Just one last thing about the history of this. So it's not just that there's an awe factor or an understanding that, yes, we do know how the solar system works and how gravitation works and how orbiting works and so on. They also were able to do extremely intricate measurements. Like the transit of Venus allowed us to know how far we are from the sun because of the triangulation, or it showed us the periodicity, the orderly periodicity of the planets. So in other words, this isn't just a moment where you say, hey, great, this is fantastic, we understand it. They use these moments, and that's why Cook was on Tahiti, so that they could cross-reference, triangulate Greenwich and other places with somewhere essentially off the face of the globe at the time, Tahiti.
Yes, it was a very complicated mathematical calculation called the parallax computation, which I've read about and written about, but to be honest, can't begin to understand because it's not only angles and triangulation. It's also a particular under measurement of the amount of time it takes for the event to transpire. So how you weave the passage of time across trigonometry, it's well beyond me. As I say, I'm in awe of eclipses, although I didn't see this. I did see the latter-day transit of Venus, which we reported on in the old Thomas Jefferson show. But all of this I stand in awe not only of the natural power of the universe, but also our species just barely beginning to develop a capability of understanding it.
And this goes back to Euclid. It's in some ways basic geometry, in some ways much more complicated. But you just mentioned another thing which is startling, which is clocks. So by the time Cook is in Tahiti, they have timepieces that are beginning to be highly accurate. In the age of Thales of the Babylonians, what is a clock? There was no such thing as precision timekeeping. There was the sunrise and the sunset and high noon and a few other things. But clocks, as we understand them, being able to tell you the time to the exact hour or minute, is really a renaissance and following invention.
Yeah, and in some way, Clay, I think modernity's development, but I think the development of standard time has demystified the world to some degree. All of this was done to accommodate modern technology, really as a function of the railroad industry in North America in the 1880s, and then it was applied on a global scale. But standard time is a latter-day adaptation, again, to try to make sense of our motion through the universe, not only on an orb that's revolving around another body of the sun, which itself is revolving in a galaxy, which is spinning through a cosmos. Again, it's just, it's wondrous.
Just one last thing about that, Dave. You probably saw, and I was astonished, that NASA is now wanting to have time zones or standard time on the moon. We've taken the Enlightenment grid and we've projected it for the first time onto another celestial orb.
I did see that. And they did it in order to accommodate and plan for future missions, rather than tying everything to earthbound time. So, Clay, I note that the next total eclipse of the sun is in 2044, and it's going to be passing through North Dakota. Were you aware of that fact?
No, but thank goodness I'll be dead.
Yeah, I would be 96 at that time. I don't think I'll make it. I've yet to see a total eclipse. There was one in 1979 that would have come right over where I live now, here at the southern tip of Puget Sound. But and I remember that well because the Friday before that Monday eclipse, my father died, and the following Monday, the day of the eclipse, I was in the funeral cortege, as it were, going to his service, and so I missed that one. I've seen glimmers of some other things. I did my best this past week, but it was just too cloudy. Surprise! It was overcast in western Washington.
So let me get this straight. You did not see this eclipse.
I tried dutifully. I could not see a hint of it. Although some people in the nearby area were able to get a break in the clouds, and I saw that little bite out of the southeast corner.
We need to take a short break. We're talking about the eclipse of April 8th, 2024 in Chaco Canyon. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. Today, the eclipse. And here's more of that remarkable experience. So you mentioned Niagara or the Grand Canyon or really splendid places to see this eclipse. I can claim one of them for you, Chaco Canyon. And let me tell you why. Chaco Canyon is in northwestern New Mexico. It's think of what we used to call the Anasazi world of cliff dwellings and so on. That term Anasazi is no longer used. Ancestral Pueblo or Puebloans is the term of choice these days, or Chaco people. But I did not know before I went there, Dave, that it is itself a calendar, that it was designed so that when the equinoxes occur, the light shines on a certain place in the cliffside, and when the solstices occur, it also is set as a calendar complex to be able to record precisely, and that this knowledge, imagine what it took to come up with this knowledge. And you can't just say, let's build this here. You have to wait until the equinoxes and say, if it's going to be built, it's going to have to be in such and such a configuration, and you have to wait for the solstice. And if you're predicting eclipses, it could take years before you can even begin to build. And here's this people that we would call primitive, who disappeared in the 9th or 10th century, or at least were morphed into modern Puebloan people. And they had this incredibly sophisticated understanding. I was told while we were there that they actually had an official person known as the skywatcher. That was your job. You were a skywatcher, and all you did for all your life was watch these events and gain greater and greater precision over time, and then be able to help interpret that knowledge with medicine men, or what sometimes are called shaman, so that the culture would be able to learn from this. But I also learned that this determined when they planted, it determined when they harvested, it determined when their festivals were. And so this is absolutely amazing. It was stunning to be there. And I was one of about 12 people at this national monument in the middle of nowhere. It's one of the greatest things that I've ever seen. And to be there with my little glasses, my special protective eyewear, and to be able to look up, it was about 4/5 occluded, so not entirely, but it was amazing. Now, you will recall that I was able to see the last one in totality in Wyoming, and that's a special kind of thing because the light goes out in the world, everything goes dead silent. There's a little moment where you suck into your breath, like, oh my goodness, the sun went out, even though you're aware of the science of it. 4/5 is not the same. It got a little bit less bright, but it doesn't take much sun to maintain its capacity to lighten the Earth. And so I think that I was in as good a place as you can ever be for this, and I gained just unbelievable respect for the people who did that site, Chaco, and it gave me more respect for the thing that I was observing, to be in a place where people that I've never really thought about much in my life were onto the very same cosmic situation.
Yes, it's your recounting of that, Clay, just goes to the point that I was trying to make earlier. You said it so much better, but we're talking about such deep time. I'm not talking about the deep time of the cosmos. I'm just talking about the deep time of humanity's sense of itself on this sphere. You're talking, who knows how many generations you're having to talk about so that you can detect this pattern. I mean, we'll go from the sublime to the ridiculous. It did get dark here. I did sense there was a little loss of general ambient light. It's nonetheless true that our house, in fact, I can look due east, and our house is oriented towards the east. And at certain times of the year, the sun, as it's on its path through the sky, the light will shine right down the hallway. And every year, just like your skywatcher down there in New Mexico, I'll get up in the morning, the sun will be usually in early March, and then again in late September, the rising sun will be shining down the hallway. I'll get up, I'll come out and exclaim to my wife, "Stonehenge."
Well, I sit at my kitchen table, and so it faces east and south, and I have huge windows there. That's where I work. And in the winter, the sun creeps across the sky until I can't even see it coming up. And then I think, okay, and then you kind of forget about it. And sometime around April 1st, you realize, oh my goodness, it's swept all the way north. It's almost off the window sights from the other direction. And at that time you become overwhelmed with a sense of how much more interesting everything is than you think on a day-to-day basis. When you get up, you look at the clock, you put something in the microwave, you make a little coffee, or you look online, it says sunset at such and such a time, sunrise at such and such a time. When you actually, those moments when we come alive to the way the world works.
Yes, and you don't have to be a student of Cook or an Enlightenment scholar to appreciate this. And I think that's why, most of the people who you were in an exceptional circumstance with a small group of people. But I think most everyone realizes there's something bigger than ourselves at play here. And I think that's what draws us. I mean, working people, young people, yes, maybe some people with more sophisticated understanding of physics and astronomy. But there's something about this clock and the pattern that the moving cosmos creates around us that I think in some deep, almost biological way, Clay, our species has a sense of this. It's a deep, almost ancestral memory, and that's why there is a Stonehenge. That's why there is the canyon you were at. That's why my little channel here in Tumwater. These are all of a piece. It's a deep, ancient memory of humanity trying to gain some sense of awareness and appreciation for where we find ourselves in the universe.
So, Dave, if you were really an Enlightenment correspondent, how far would you have had to go to see this thing in totality?
Well, probably the closest, if I were inclined to go view it.
Which, by the way, how can you be the Enlightenment correspondent and be disinclined to go see it? But go ahead.
Well, I had other obligations. I have a book that I had to proof and get ready for publication, so I had other commitments.
Listen to this, everybody. You were probably waiting to talk to Mad Dog Russo, and you couldn't go outside.
And I had some baseball games to go to.
Right, exactly.
Alice. But what I know now, if I had had a choice, I would have gone to Niagara Falls for the reason I cited earlier. That's where I would have gone. And Chris and I were just there half a year ago, last August, for our anniversary, and we couldn't get enough of that whole atmosphere.
So you remember we'll let you go in here in a minute, but you remember that other great Enlightenment story? I think it's in Andrea Wolf's book, Chasing Venus, where was it a Frenchman who went to India on the first round of the transit of Venus, and it was cloudy. He went there, he built a scaffold, he built a compound, he had everything. He had amanuenses and observers and note takers, and it was cloudy. So he goes back to France, and the second time, 7 or 8 years later, he goes back to India, and it clouded over again. He missed it both times.
Yeah, just crazy. And that, of course, is why the planners of the International Observance of the Transit of Venus, that famous episode in Enlightenment history, because there was a sequence of sightings, 1761, 1769, but that gentleman's predicament and fate is precisely why people were sent to Hudson Bay, Cabo San Lucas, and Tahiti in order to get a multiplicity of perspectives, because the chances are any one of them might have proved unproductive, and indeed many did for the reasons you cite.
You've got to fan out so you can be sure that at least somebody will be in clear skies that day. And one last thing about this, Jefferson was nothing if not filled with childlike wonder about all of this. This for him was exactly what the modern world must do. And he seems to have kind of missed the first one in 1761, but he writes to David Rittenhouse, who is the principal mathematician and astronomer of the United States. David Rittenhouse, who produced a planetarium called an orrery, which Jefferson got a copy of tried to get a copy of for Monticello, and I've seen the original in Philadelphia. Rittenhouse then sends him all this information, helps him get the chronometer that he wants, advises him on the telescope you want to be using, and gives him notations about how to observe this. So Jefferson went into this in a big way, and for him it was partly cloudy the second time, but for Jefferson this was almost the point of being alive as a figure of the Enlightenment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it was as big a deal in Enlightenment science, partly because of its communal nature, Clay. I mean, I keep coming back to that because I think that's the common denominator here, is that it's a communal experience. People can appreciate it and participate in it in a way all over the world. Now, a total eclipse of the sun's kind of more site-specific. And indeed, you couldn't see the transit of Venus all over the world either. In fact, that's another amazing thing. Astronomers had to figure out, Clay,
where to go in order to see it. And famously, the people at the Royal Society, they drew a trapezoid that roughly kind of bridged the equator in the South Pacific, and the insurer, get somewhere within this trapezoid and you'll be able to find it. And at the very last minute, news of Tahiti's encounter, an earlier encounter in Tahiti, came to the Royal Society and the Admiralty, and Cook was sent specifically there. But up until about 6 months before he left, he was just heading to a zone on Earth where some set of astronomers have said, the transit will be visible here, find a place, get there in plenty of time, observe it, and report back. And you mentioned the communal nature of this, and I'm not certain that I agree with you about the deep instinct, but I'm hoping you're right. What struck me about this one is that because we're in the age of social media, all these major players are saying, send us your photos. The more photos we can get from around the world to build this database, partly for aesthetic purposes and for entertainment value, but partly because given the ubiquity of smartphones today, which almost automatically record latitude and longitude at the same time in the metadata, we are in a better position today to observe an eclipse or observe a transit than at any previous moment in human history, because we have the Republic of Letters. It's admittedly a pretty schlocky one, the world of social media, but it exists, and people were all too willing to share their photographs.
And photographs from space. I mean, they're just a remarkable documentation. This was probably the best recorded solar eclipse for the very reason you cite. I'm kind of sad that it's gone, but there'll be other things to look forward to. I'm sure of some note.
Well, you and I are almost at the time when we look forward to the next solstice, because we can't predict how many decades we're going to be continuing as amateur Enlightenment correspondents in this business. Dave, it's always a pleasure to talk with you about these things. It just strikes me that the Enlightenment had it right when they said clockwork, that the universe is a clock, and yet they had it wrong in that, as you say, that sort of approach does demystify things that have been a mystery for humanity. Imagine the first people who saw a total solar eclipse, what that must have meant to their sense of fear or terror or wonder or all of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as you said, you had kind of a momentary sense of that when you were at Chaco Canyon.
I did. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to check in with you, my friend.
Okay, Clay, thanks for including me.
It's always great to talk to our friend David Nicandri, our Enlightenment correspondent, although he sat out this eclipse and watched it through the miracle of CBC Canada television instead. I've been thinking about this. Nicandri and I are both committed to the Enlightenment, the students of the period of European history between 1680, say, and the death of Thomas Jefferson in 1826. That's the world of our intellectual training. We both believe the Enlightenment was the greatest thing that ever happened to Western civilization, that due process, separation of powers, checks and balances, the Bill of Rights, the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, the guarantees both within and outside the U.S. Constitution are the best thing that has happened to human beings. And if you doubt that, go get arrested in Bulgaria or Turkey or some African state that has failed to observe the basic principles of due process. We are very fortunate in all of that. And because we see the Enlightenment, because we see celestial phenomena through that lens, we think of Captain Cook going to Tahiti in 1769, or Jefferson writing to the mathematician David Rittenhouse and saying that he would pay any price to get the instrumentation he needed to be able to observe the transit of Venus at Monticello. Now, it turned out it was cloudy. But that's the Enlightenment, wanting to measure things. They were obsessed with Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton was one of Thomas Jefferson's three heroes, Locke, Bacon, and Newton. And many people in the Enlightenment, including Voltaire, believed that Isaac Newton was the greatest man who had ever lived. So that sort of mindset has pervaded my own outlook on the world for 40 years now. And I do believe that if we were a Jeffersonian nation, minus all of the race problems, we would be a dramatically better republic than the one that we're in. So I've always looked at things like eclipses and solstices through that Newtonian lens. And it was so interesting and I think important to be pushed out of that paradigm at Chaco Canyon, because there we saw the same phenomenon, a near total solar eclipse, but we saw it through the eyes of the ancient Puebloan people and their own interest in the sky. And they had an actual person who was designated a skywatcher, and it was his work to observe the sky and to see how the planets were moving and to see any meteors that were coming through or comets, and to measure the solstices and to know how to predict an eclipse and to be able to give advice to the people about when to plant and when to migrate and when to go cut wood and when to have the harvest festival and so on. That there was a person, a kind of a Carl Sagan sort of person in the ancestral Puebloan world whose sole purpose was to watch the sky. What an extraordinary job description that would be. And it's thanks to Chaco Canyon that I was able to get out from under my own prejudices, stereotypes, presuppositions, smugness, complacency, and paradigm, and to begin, even just with a glimpse or two, to see the world through other eyes. And Thoreau says in Walden, to see the world through some other person's eyes for even a minute would be one of the most astonishing things that a human could ever experience. So it was great to be at Chaco Canyon with my friend Dennis. We had an extraordinary day, one that I will never forget. I don't know if I'll be alive for the next total solar eclipse, but I know that I can't find a better place to observe it or a better person to be with there. And our guide, Kailo, made all the difference by taking us through it with patience and generosity and grace, and allowing us to be, for a moment, a part of a world that we're aware of in books, but not much more. So that's this week's program. Thanks to everybody. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of Listening to America.